Tad DeLay, thank you so much for joining me on SCOTONOMICS. It's absolutely wonderful for me to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. Glad to be here.
Yeah. I'm so excited that we're going to be talking about this. It felt for me to have a really personal book. I kind of at the end of it, it was one of those books where I thought, I think I know the author. It was so personal. So I'm really looking forward to spending this time with you. I also think what was great about this book was the introduction. I really felt like I knew where the journey was going already when I started the introduction. Could you tell our audience the story that you start with, this introduction, in the hope that that gives them a really clear idea of what we're going to cover today?
Yes, of course. Well, thank you so much for those kind words. The introduction comes from one of a collection of stories that were sort of circulating in my head when my editor from Verso reached out and asked if I had any book ideas. And I had been more or less thinking through examples of what felt like denial, but had nothing to do with overt, conscious rejection of science, but were instead behaviors consistent with what you might expect people who don't believe in or care about the climate crisis. Like when they're suddenly confronted with the effects, how do they respond? I opened with this story from Portland in September 2020. It was a wild year. There was a pandemic in full swing. The election between Trump and Biden was approaching. The Sanders campaign had just collapsed. And over in the UK, the Corbyn platform had been similarly rejected a few months before that. Over the summer, there was the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests where, reactionaries were running people into vehicles, and people were running their cars into protesters, right? And in the midst of all of this, in September, wildfires stretched the West Coast. Something like 4 or 5 of the largest wildfires in California history were burning simultaneously. It was turning the skies like a burnt orange or even blood red at noon in some places. And in the midst of this, in Portland, which is in the Pacific Northwest, it's an overwhelmingly white area of the U.S. There were reports in at least 3 small towns around the metropolitan area of Portland that said that there were vigilantes setting up road checkpoints, slowing down evacuees fleeing fires from their surrounding areas. So the skies were burnt orange, and under those orange skies were men with assault rifles pointing weapons at people on the road, slowing them down. And the opening story is one of pointing a weapon at an African-American mother with her children in the back of the van. And what they are doing is looking for Antifa arsonists. There was a number of conspiracy theories proliferating on social media that these fires were not started by by sort of accident or lightning or any of the standard ways, that these were specifically Antifa terrorists going into the forest and setting these fires. And so that's what they were looking for. There was also, cops were alerted to these checkpoints but didn't intervene. Some cops were asking for pictures of license plates. There was one cop who speculated that people would simply stay home and die in the fire instead of going out to risk running into Antifa activists. There was another cop who explained to a citizens group, this was caught on camera, explaining how they should kill outsiders if they found them on their hunt for leftists starting fires. To me, to kind of wrap this up, to me, this is an expression of climate change denial, right? We're seeing the effects of in terms of wildfires that scientists have long predicted. But when you confront those effects with people on the ground who have all kinds of conspiracy theories swirling in their head and all sorts of grievances that they want to work out, and a desire to control things, and climate change is not one of the things that we can control, right? But putting down an enemy, putting them in their place, shooting them is something that one can do personally, right? When all of these things are swirling in the vortex of the American misinformation and rage machine, this is what denial looks like today, right? It has to be enacted. It's libidinal. It has to create enjoyment for the reactionary.
It's a frightening story that you tell. And, as you said, it was in 2020. So the obvious question is, well, thank God everything's so much better now in 2020.
Right. Yes.
Your thoughts, looking back, because it's like, especially when you've been thinking at a book and you're looking back, 4 years can seem like quite a short period of time when you started the germination of this idea and where we are now. What's your reflections on those 4 years, considering the Biden administration, all the other things that's been happening? If you think about this kind of weird world we're in with Elon Musk and Twitter at the moment, could you summarize those 4 years in terms of the denial
Sure.
in which we are?
Sure. So I think the basic epistemic void on the right is nearly identical, right? We still have this problem, and this is true of the liberal center for sure as well. But one of my big convictions as a philosophy professor is that it is quite tragic that most people seem not to really care, not only whether their beliefs are true or not, but even what they believe, right? People very often kind of latch on to kind of the most recent thing that they heard, or if you challenge them on a belief that may be core to the way that they live their life, they might switch very quickly and pretend to now suddenly care about believe the exact opposite and so forth. And in right-wing conspiracy world, like in America, for example, it still seems to be the case that roughly 1 in 5 of our population believes that the last election was stolen, right? Now we have other kinds of movements where, the Biden Inflation Reduction Act, right, was the largest climate change legislation to have ever pushed through Congress. Not nearly as big as the Corbyn platform or the Sanders platform, right? But it is nevertheless like the biggest step forward in climate change legislation that we've ever seen. Nevertheless, like if you think about how that was reported, right, the modeling suggested that it would cut emissions 40% over 2005 levels, although the modeling also suggested emissions would drop 30 to 35% over 2005 levels even without it, right, which means the Inflation Reduction Act was actually projected to cut emissions 5 to 10%. But in the media, and that's just over 2005 levels. But in the media, it was often reported, and even by Congress people who were tweeting this out, it was reported as if it was going to cut emissions 40% over 8 years, right? And so you kind of get this kind of, people who aren't keeping track of these numbers, it's very difficult to what's the difference between 40% and 5%? Well, it's quite big, right? But it depends on a bunch of nuance, right? And then other things kind of completely fly under the radar, right? So we are on track as of this year to quadruple new fossil fuel leases by 2030. And that's mostly driven by the US, right? And so you have the Biden administration taking steps forward in one way and then taking steps backwards the other. Obviously, Kamala Harris's campaign has removed opposition to fracking from her platform and so forth. And so I think to kind of say it all, I think the situation is nearly identical, right? We still have right wingers that are ready and primed for violence. We see like over whether we're talking in the UK with the sort of like anti-Muslim, there's certainly a drive for the new pogrom, right? That's inflected with racism and anti-immigrant anger and all of that. And we certainly see our different versions of that over in the US, right? Although it's not typically inflected with a hostility towards people migrating from Africa or Arabness per se, right? It's a very kind of anti-Latinx type of racism that's just generally being inflected more than that. And so we have the same sort of racism, conspiracy mongering and so forth on the right. We still have the same, let's take one step forward and 2 steps back in the liberal center. And so it feels like very familiar territory to me, yes.
And that is such a horrible position to be in, isn't it? What about very briefly then, just very briefly, taking this a few years forward, can you see, and I know so much in America relies on who wins the presidential election, but let's say that it's Kamala Harris and we're moving forward into a few years. Can you see the position of the need to drastically reduce emissions, but also kind of material footprint and usage? Can you see that in any way changing over the next, let's say, half decade?
Kamala Harris's politics are opposed to any sort of really government-driven planned economy. I have a hard time seeing a big change that is anything other than tweaking with feed-in tariffs, tax write-off for energy. So more of the same of what we have now, right? Tax incentives for installing solar panels on your home or improving energy efficiency. There is talk already of an IRA Part 2, depending on how the House and Senate races go, right? There's certainly intention to move forward, but it will be moving forward in more of the same, right? That movement forward can always take steps backwards, right? Because If we hit another energy shock, say we hit another Ukraine type situation where gas can skyrocket several times over, overnight, it may be the case that we want to say, as Biden recently tweeted out, you can do both. You can increase the access to fossil fuels, and do the energy transition at once, right? Now, it is true, more or less is true worldwide, that we are building up renewables at an like almost unbelievable rate, although that is mostly driven by China, right? Like more than half of it is driven by China, which is like the evidence for the planned economy, right? But we are building out renewables, but more or less globally, we are still piling them on top of fossil fuels. This is not true in all countries, but the U.S. is skyrocketing renewables, while it also has become the chief exporter of gas and oil, right?
What we're saying is that we are increasing renewables, but we're increasing energy use overall. So as a percentage of our energy use, it's not dramatically changing because our energy use is increasing as well.
Right. Yes. If you were tracking total energy, fossil fuels, and renewables on a graph, you would see them all shooting up right now.
Yeah.
You would see fossil fuels starting to level off clearly in the last 10 years, but they're still creeping up. Renewables are skyrocketing, but so is the large energy pile. So like what this means is this is a hard thing to kind of get your mind around, but renewables actually don't help you with global warming innately, right? Renewables help you turn down temperatures or stop temperature rise if they're used to displace fossil fuels, only if they are used to displace fossil fuels, because the carbon dioxide emissions is the problem, right? It's similar to kind of the oddity of, I mean, I don't want to lend too much credence to this, but burning fossil fuels does not drive global temperature change. Releasing the emissions from the fossil fuels is what drives global temperature change, right? You could theoretically cap it all, they're not going to, right? So I don't want to give that too much attention, right? But in the same way, building out renewables does not fight global warming if we are not also drawing down our fossil fuel expansion. Instead of as I mentioned before, we are on track to quadruple new oil leases by 2030, driven mostly by the US, but also various other actors.
Well, we're definitely on the same page then. I was at a meeting in Edinburgh just a couple of weeks ago, and everyone was talking about how inspired and hopeful they were that it looks like there would be a Democratic president in America. And I'd just finished writing a paper where I'd kind of postulated that we have a policy paradigm that seems impossible to move beyond. And I just read a lot of stuff by Donella Meadows, and a quote I wanted to give to you was from our paper she wrote in 1999. And she said that you can't expect the system to change if if someone's just changing the faucets at a slightly different speed, but with all the information, all the same goals, and all the same outcomes. And she says in this paper, sure, Clinton's a bit better than, I think it was Bob Dole, I think he ran against in around about that period. Sure, it's better, but it doesn't make any difference because it's the same old system. And that's what we're looking at, I think, in the States, and we're seeing that in the United Kingdom at the moment, where we're expecting a lot more from a supposedly left-wing Labour government, but they're stuck within this kind of policy paradigm where they just can't seem to break out of it. Now that paradigm is certainly a capitalist paradigm, but kind of when you analyse it, I think that the defining factor of that paradigm is growth. We seem to have constructed an economy purely designed to ensure, or to try and ensure, that the economy grows. What's your thoughts on the impact and the power of this idea of growth, and growth of the economy always being good?
Yeah, so it's a very theological concept to say that the growth of the economy must be good, right? And it is interesting that we talk about the economy as if it is more or less an object that exists that is moral in nature, right? It can be good or bad, right? Now there are limits to how far I can make this little witty jab here, right? Because at the end of the day, we're talking about very often the ability of people to procure food or electricity or housing for themselves, right? But the concept of growth is something that comes into the fore in the early modern period, right? You don't find, when Aristotle is talking about value, right? He's not talking in terms of growth in the same way that we would conceive of an economy as something that exists to grow, right? In fact, I mean, there's a little bit of a sidebar, but and for many ancient Greek thinkers, right, the purpose of ordering the house, the economy, is to provide for the city-state, right? And the city-state should not grow larger than what it needs to be. Like, it should be able to feed all of its citizens, but not expand beyond that, right? We take it as sort of an article of faith now that it's good that capitalism expands anywhere from 1%, which is a little too low, to 4 or 5%, which is about as high as we want it to go without triggering inflation. Right. And so the concept of growth is taken to be like as an article of faith good. And that is, I talk in my book about how on a very long timeline you run into just purely mathematically, thermodynamically like limits to this, right? Because the economy, when it grows, almost all economic activity takes energy, right? So when you talk about growth, you're talking about a growth in energy as well. That is almost one-to-one. And if you consume enough energy, even if you're using all clean renewables that emit no fossil fuels, you basically heat the surface of the Earth up to, you eventually get to boiling point, and we're all dead, right? So in a long enough timeline, and I plot this out in the book with several different paradigms to kind of say somewhere in the nature of like 300 to 700 years, according to the way that growth and energy are linked. It's inevitable that if we don't cook ourselves, we will have to move into some sort of planned steady state economy, energy in, energy out, goods in, goods out, recycled, right? Now, that's hundreds of years, though, into the future. Like in the short term, the most salient component here is that the coupling of emissions and growth, right? So when you spend so GDP and gross domestic product, which, by the way, maybe a word on this, gross domestic product is a concept that has really only been used to any sort of meaningful extent for the last century, right? So we could be a century out and no longer using gross domestic product, even without a communist revolution or anything like that, right? Like, we just might find that it's actually kind of a ridiculous tool. It doesn't measure like well-being and all these other critiques that you get. But as it goes today, worldwide CO2 emissions and GDP have a 0.93 correlation coefficient. Atmospheric CO2 concentration and world GDP per capita have a 0.98 correlation coefficient, right? So that means that for every dollar we spend, we're getting a quantity of almost we're almost getting like a perfect quantity of atmospheric CO2 injected, right? And there are similar correlations between atmospheric CO2 and world primary energy, which is 0.98, or atmospheric CO2 concentration and world GDP, which is 0.96, these types of things, right? So essentially the way that we talk about this abstractly is that emissions and GDP are coupled, as are GDP and primary energy use. They are also pretty coupled, but not quite as tightly. Energy use and fossil fuels are also pretty tightly coupled, right? Because 4/5 of our energy comes from fossil fuels, right? And so it's not within our ability to break these relationships today, right? If we wanted to, so like one way to say this is that if we stopped using fossil fuels today, one of the things that would happen for the economy is an 80% economic loss, right? We would have 80% GDP loss, meaning that we would go into a depression 2 or 3 times worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s, right? Because of the close coupling, right? And so, and then I don't know if you want to kind of steer this back to your question about growth or anything, please feel free. But I think this starts to give us an idea of what the problem is, and just to kind of return to this idea that GDP is an explanation for why something is good, right? If an investment banker produces a lot of return on investment, their work is said to be good and it's rewarded financially, right? Even if it actually does no social good or even makes the world worse. If I lead a book study, this makes the world a little bit better, but it doesn't contribute to GDP, right? So nobody cares. I'm not getting paid for that, right? If I get into a ghastly car accident on the way home, then that's a massive contributor to GDP. It's wonderful for the ambulance, for the insurance, for payouts, the car companies that has to replace the car and everything, right? So it's an insane metric, and to think that growth is just innately good it's a theology, but it's a theology for damning the earth.
Two important points there, because you'll hear people say, well, actually, we've decoupled emissions and energy use in certain countries. And I always respond to that and say, yeah, that's good, but the climate doesn't care if the country's done it. This has got to be a measurement at the global level. And if we're not decoupling at the global level, then it doesn't matter what individual countries are doing. It's got to be a decoupling at the global level for it to have
Yes. Yeah, and then, like, I mean, two quick points on that, because people often say this, and I understand where that comes from, and I don't think that that's coming from a bad place. Like, it's great that we're decoupling in some sense, right? I mean, like the only part of that I really care about is that emissions are dropping, right? If your economy is growing at the same time. 2 points on that, though. Yes, it is true that in about 36 states we're seeing economic growth while seeing dropping emissions. The first problem here is the stock and flow problem, right? So even so what matters for global warming is the total stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, not the rate at which they're flowing in. And if you decouple an economy, but it's growing economically, but it's still pumping in any CO2 whatsoever, it is still contributing to growth of rising of temperatures, right? Because temperatures will continue to rise until emissions reach zero, right? So that's the number one problem. The second one is this will be much more varied country to country and what time window we're talking about. But I use the example of Obama in my book in 2015 talking about, or 2017, something like that, talking about how the U.S. economy grew under him while also decoupling from emissions, right? And if you look at where the sources of decoupling were at that time, about a solid third of it was switching from coal to natural gas, right? Which
that's almost the same as happened in the United Kingdom, just slightly about a
yes,
the same. I kind of say to people, that's the low hanging fruit. That huge big drop when you move from coal to natural gas. That's it.
So there's a floor there, right? Because you can't keep dropping. Eventually you level out if you just were to run all of your energy on natural gas, right? And it also means that you're bragging about switching from one fossil fuel to the other, right? And this is where the transition fuel language comes from, right? But now we have an entire infrastructure built on this quote unquote transition fuel, and that infrastructure could be around for several decades before it's retired, right? Still pumping out carbon dioxide.
It's fascinating listening to you, because you're saying so many of these points which are really clear to myself as a heterodox economist. All these things.
Well, thank you.
All these things make perfect sense. You're talking about how difficult it is actually to transition because of all the infrastructure that's already in place. And the kind of orthodox response to this crisis is that price. If you make renewables really cheap, then we'll be able to transition almost kind of overnight without this deep understanding of this kind of infrastructural tie-in that we have and how difficult it is. In your book, you say that kind of we've got a chance, summarizing a little bit, I suppose, we've got a chance with renewables under capitalism if they're profitable.
Right.
I think that really for me was a real kind of highlight of you summing up the problems, not just with the climate crisis, but with capitalism in general. We will only fix it if there's a profit in it. Would you just like to kind of expand on that in terms of the concerns with capitalism as the way that we have decided that we should allocate the resources? Your kind of, Marxist perspective on the problems of capitalism, I suppose, what I'm after.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a quick point before shifting into that germane to this, right, is that I believe you're talking about the point at which I talk about the levelized cost of energy, which is a way of being able to compare renewables and fossil fuels, because renewables take a massive investment up front, but then they're basically free for 10 years, right, with solar, right? Whereas coal is a tiny investment, but it's constant. So the levelized cost of energy of renewables has come down to equal with, or in some cases slightly below, fossil fuels. There's a really wonderful book, even with more recent data than mine, called The Price is Wrong by Brett Christophers, right? And also out by Verso, that does a really, really good job of explaining exactly why it is, even though it is very counterintuitive, why it is that cheaper renewables are not driving the transition, right? So we have really good, it seems to like the traditional neoclassical economists that cheaper renewables should lead to a shift to, renewables, right? So like, how could they not? Well, part of the problem is that markets do not incentivize paying as little as possible. They incentivize profit, right? And if you can, if your energy inputs cost a massive amount, like natural gas, right after Russia invades Ukraine, but the market is going to pay out a much higher inflated cost of energy, then those can stay in circulation for forever. And because of the way energy is purchased by utility companies on the spot market, where they basically kind of map out a day before how much they think they're going to need in terms of energy, they produce what is called a stack, where they have like companies bid in to produce that energy. So you might, like, lowest on the stack might be a very cheap renewable, like solar panel at midday, like in that little half hour time slot that they're looking to fill. And then they go up the stack with more and more expensive fuels up until they get to coal or natural gas. But the point that coal or natural gas bids in is what everybody gets paid, right? And so that means that coal and natural gas can still turn a profit. Now, under certain conditions, that's really good for renewables, because if they generate for very little cost, but they're getting the price points that coal and natural gas bid in, then they're getting a heyday. The problem often comes down to financing, right? Banks don't want to finance renewables projects if they're not able to say on paper, here's what we think our ROI is going to be 10 years out, right? You can do that with natural gas, because you can kind of say whatever the ROI is, we're going to be able to pull it from them. Like if our costs go up, we're going to be able to charge more.
Yeah.
Renewables can't do that. So there's this whole problem. But skipping over to capitalism, right? So I'm approaching this generally as a Marxist. I don't think of economics as my forte per se. If I'm being honest, or a little bit cheeky even, I think of economics as kind of an offshoot or an inverted form of theology that's essentially trying to figure out who deserves what and why certain people deserve to suffer. But doing so,
you see much more economic sense in this book than thousands of neoclassical books out there.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I appreciate that very much. Well, I mean, so as someone generally approaching this as a Marxist, and there's all kinds of problems with like value form and sub critiques that we could kind of get into, but generally what Marx says is that in the capitalist mode of production, you have three categories of value: exchange value and use value. Those are the terms that come from Adam Smith and David Ricardo, right? You have the use value that you can use with something, right? Like the use value of a pen is writing with it. The exchange value of a pen might be $1. And then the surplus value is the value produced by the worker that is over and above what they are compensated in all of the materials they turn into their final product, right? So the simplest way to think about this, like when I talk to my students about like these concepts, is everybody understands that their employer is getting more value out of them than the value that they are paid in their paycheck, plus all of the materials that go into whatever they do, right? There's some surplus that is created by the worker. And this is a theological like doctrine for Marx, right? Like, because you could point like where is value in other places, or you could question the concept of value. But for Marx, take it axiomatically, religiously, theologically, that the value is created by the worker, and that value, that surplus value, is what a neoclassical economist calls profit, right? In other words, even a neoclassical economist could admit that if a worker was paid for the full value of the work that they do, there would be no profit, right? So if you're paid for what your work worth, you're not living in capitalism, right? So what this means on an aggregate scale is that labor transform raw materials, right? It takes materials out of, for example, lithium. Another laborer turns it into a battery and then sells it on the market. But those workers have created more value than is compensated in their wages or the materials cost. And that becomes profit for like Elon Musk or a battery manufacturer or something like that, right? So all of this leads to what Marx calls a law of capitalist accumulation. This is really kind of the most simple kind of concept here, but capitalism can only reward a continuous expansion of surplus accumulation, right? If there is not a continuous expansion of surplus accumulation, another competing firm that's able to drive up their rate of surplus exploitation will come in and outcompete the company that's not able to get its surplus exploitation higher, right? And then that you have the monopoly, right? You have the competition among the capitalist classes, right? So our problem today is that we live in capitalism if we're talking about a law of capitalist accumulation, you're basically talking about an algorithm, right? A very simple algorithm, but an algorithm is just a rule for taking taking inputs and projecting it on a range of outputs, right? This algorithm says that the only thing that we're going to gauge success by, the only thing that we're going to materially reward is continuous accumulation, continuous, what a neoclassical would say, growth, right? And so if that's all that you're ultimately rewarding, then things like, I don't know, do we want to have a habitable biosphere or keep temperatures at 1.5 degrees? That is not in the algorithm. That can be an offshoot if you're able to extract enough profit. It's not innately conflicting with it, but it's not in the algorithm's directions to be able to keep temperatures or a habitable biosphere.
And neither is efficacy or justice. These things are just completely outside of that simple
Yes,
calculation.
this is why Marx, like whenever anybody brought up justice, right, he would like to laugh in their face about, like, oh, you tell me about your ideals, I'll tell you about the material relations that are militating against those ideals, right? Which is funny because if you read Marx, it's very clear that justice is constantly on his mind, right? But he wants to disavow it and say, I don't have time for these ideals about like doing what's good for the economy and what's doing good for the planet, right? You have picked a side, right? And it's very, and like there's no use in pretending like you haven't picked a side here.
I wanted to talk about some of the supposed solutions to the crisis that we have. And hopefully we can cover these briefly. Looking at the huge issue with a stock of emissions that's likely to lead to warming and other ecological collapse at some point. And we're saying, we've got to stop the flow. We've got to stop adding to this massive stock, or we've got to be in a situation where we're starting to draw down this stock. So let's talk about that first idea of kind of carbon capture and storage. So Tad, that's the solution. Everything you're saying, it's not going to happen because of carbon storage. Would you like to give me a little bit of your thoughts on this wonderful new invention we've come up with, which is going to save us all?
Yeah, okay, all right. So our sort of like very simple schema here is if we continue putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, temperatures go up. If we keep greenhouse gases level at where they are now, they will begin to, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere will begin to drop. If we got to net zero emissions, temperatures level out, right? Because carbon dioxide starts dropping, oceans keep warming, and so they balance out, right? The only way to drop temperatures is by zeroing out emissions and using carbon capture, right? Or more or less zeroing out emissions. There's some sectors that are going to be hard to decarbonize, like steel production, because there's just so much greenhouse gases everywhere. But if we can get everywhere at a steel mill, but if we can get greenhouse gases down to about 10% of where they are now, we could theoretically start using meaningful carbon capture to not only cancel out those 10% of emissions, but draw down even some more, right, and lower temperatures back down, right? So we know how to do this. We know how to scrub the air of carbon dioxide. We've been able to do that for a long time. That's what makes space flight or submarines possible. There's a number of different ways to do this, and the most simple way that people talk about carbon capture is by planting trees, right? I'm not against trees. Like, I don't want to oppose planting more trees. They're aesthetically pleasing.
I hope you weren't against trees. I think
no, I'm not at all, right? But they're aesthetically pleasing. They cool down cities, and they draw down carbon dioxide. But there was a recent study kind of gauging how much we could actually plant So basically, the upshot is that if we planted every single tree we could on the entire face of the earth, it would draw down carbon dioxide. By the time they mature in 20 or 30 years, it would draw down carbon dioxide something like 50 parts per million off our current 420. All right. So in other words, that takes us back to carbon dioxide levels roughly 2003-ish, right? Which is a big improvement, but we would still have a world that would inexorably shoot over 1.5, 2 degrees, eventually to 3, just on a much slower timeline, right? So that would help, right? But it's we're not going to plant every tree in the world, and right. So I really want to talk about trees as kind of a distraction here, although I am all for planting more trees, right? Other options are things that you hear about, like direct air capture. Where the direct air capture is extremely expensive, and it's something like 600. Sometimes you can even find direct air capture plants that charge over $1,000, I believe, per ton. Still, we think that number will get down to something like $100 a ton. That's the hope, and then some people are even kind of projecting $50 a ton by mid-century. But if we get carbon capture, direct air capture, these machines such as like the Orca complex in Ireland, or these 4 MW mega facilities that the IRA is supposed to build. Not Ireland, Iceland. Sorry,
Iceland,
or in Iceland. Yeah. But if we were able to get these machines churning out carbon dioxide capture from the air at $100 a ton, we could offset the global CO2 emissions, but it would cost about it would cost $5 trillion now. It would cost $16 trillion per year in a high energy growth scenario. And so we were talking essentially about $5 trillion out of a global economy of roughly $100 trillion a year is quite a lot, right? We could theoretically do it, but we're not going to. It also has other problems, right? Direct air capture doesn't use a lot of land, whereas trees do use a lot of land. Other types of carbon capture use more land or water or whatever. Direct air capture's big problem is that it uses an enormous amount of energy, right? It more or less takes twice as much energy to pull carbon dioxide out of the air with a carbon capture machine than it does to put it in the air in the first place, right? So, this gets back to our energy transition problem. You could theoretically pull it all out for $5 trillion a year, but you'd have to direct a massive amount of your economy to this sector, and you would also have to double your energy inputs in order to be able to support it. So that's one problem. And we also get examples like solar radiation management, which are I think among the most horrifying.
Just to kind of summarize what you're saying is there's a technological possibility, but a practical application of that to an extent where it makes any significant difference to the problems that we've got is kind of extreme, and as the IPCC reports do, they build in carbon capture already for the scenarios that individual governments have put forward to reduce their carbon emissions, especially BECCS, bioenergy and carbon capture. So it's already built into some of these projections. And we're seeing a huge issue already with this idea that we can store the carbon or capture the carbon or pull it down. So that was kind of where we were with that one. The next one I wanted to talk about was carbon offsets. So this is a solution, Tad. Carbon offsets are the solution. Do you want to give me your thoughts on that?
Yeah, very, very similar to our tree problem before, right? So let's just remember, if we plant every tree possible in the entire world, which we're not going to do, but if we did, it would take us down 49 or 50 parts per million carbon dioxide and put us back to roughly 2003 levels. So offsets are, an offset is usually one offset equals 1 ton of carbon dioxide, 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. They can look a number of different ways. You can have the offsets of like direct air capture, which costs $600 a ton. And I do want to emphasize, as part of the market problem, right, is that the way that direct air capture facilities are often financed is that they're being sold as offsets, right? So they're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but it's some other company making a purchase so that they can sell credits to yet more companies that are emitting, right? So you have these kind of middlemen that are sort of financing it. So the cheapest types of offsets are going to be $2 or $3 instead of $600, right? So you can imagine which the market's going to direct itself towards. And those $2 or $3 a ton offsets are trees. So when we talk about tree offsets, we can think in 2 broad categories. First, there's the planting of trees, but then there's also the easements on trees that already exist, right? My go-to example in the book is Delta Airlines claiming in 2020 that it was going to be carbon neutral from there on out. They would have hit basically any target they put that year because a month later a pandemic hit and tanked global air travel. But what they essentially did in there, according to their ESG reports, they bought up a lot of land in the Philippines or Indonesia, land that wouldn't have necessarily been cut down at all. And then they claimed that land, right? So I really want to emphasize, sometimes the way that carbon offsets happen is a company plants a tree and tells you that whatever offset you're responsible for as part of that, company's purchasing, right? You're offsetting with a new tree. It's never really offsetting your full emissions, but there's at least some positive new good introduced by planting a tree. But a lot of offsets are literally just purchasing land that already exists in the developing world usually, right? So we're talking about expropriating indigenous peoples or people who are very poor, or governments that are sort of selling off public land to private investors. And then the most salient point for climatology here is that if you're just selling off and switching around on the ledgers existing land, then you're not actually carbon capturing anything, right? It's just that all of a sudden Delta Airlines gets to say I'm carbon neutral when actually the exact same amount of CO2 is going to the atmosphere, not just from Delta, but from everywhere in the world, right? And so I always liken it to like a 3-card Monty with the atmosphere, a shell game, right? Like, like where's the carbon? Like look under these 3 shells or whatever, because the carbon dioxide is still there. It's still getting injected. It's just that a company can claim on paper to be neutral. One final thing on that: the first carbon offset that I've been able to find was an 1989 American energy company that wanted to build a new coal plant. And so what they did was they planted something like 50 non-native trees in Guatemala, had the legislature pass a bunch of laws penalizing locals from being able to chop down firewood, and then called it even. And basically studies later said that nothing was captured, right? So it wasn't meaningful, but it did actually harm people in the short term, people on the ground.
When you dig down in this, you see this kind of continuation of colonial extraction, and you see the damage that we are inflicting on the global south to continue our relationship, our addiction with fossil fuel. And I think the carbon credits is a really good example of that. Now, the one really fascinating thing that came out of the book for me was the genesis of the idea of carbon footprints. People might be surprised to hear where that came from. Do you want to just give us a brief explanation on the idea and who came up with it?
Right. So there's a genealogy that stretches back to the late 20th century of an ecological footprint, which measures a range of ways in which we impact our environment. But in the early aughts, the British Petroleum tries to rebrand as lowercase BP to be cool. Gets a new logo with green and yellow as this kind of a sunburst, and runs an ad blitz with handheld cameras asking people what their carbon footprint is. One of the most successful advertising campaigns of all time, because now we all know what a carbon footprint is, right? And my sense is it's not entirely BP that introduces this concept, right? But BP gets it out in front of people and is constantly asking, what's your carbon footprint? They introduce a carbon footprint calculator on their website, so it becomes fun. Like it becomes an interactive game a little bit. If you go to that website today, you're offered to purchase carbon offsets, and if you kind of tally up, the total offsets to offset everything, all of the emissions kind of in the global economy, it comes to just like a couple $100 billion or something absurdly cheap, right? So BP introduces this carbon footprint concept as a type of greenwash, right? A way to present itself as a responsible actor. And surveys later on showed that consumers do think of BP as a cleaner oil and gas company. In fact, it's very common when I'm having this discussion with people for people to say, "Oh yeah, I guess I do actually kind of like when I see Exxon and BP, I go to BP because I think of them as the more responsible actor," right? It is still affecting people today, right? But yeah, surveys showed that people thought of BP as being more ecologically responsible when their oil and gas are literally the exact same product dug out of some Permian basin that Exxon is using, right? So yeah, it's a wild concept to try to moralize and get us to think about your sins, right? And it's your iniquities that need to be offset. You need to purchase. This is theology again, but you need to purchase the indulgence, like in the 16th century to kind of offset your sins with the Catholic Church and cut time off purgatory. Now you need to do the same thing to justify yourself in front of the global economy, which judges you mercilessly, right?
For me, it really connected with this idea of agency and this use of the word we. And BP are these massive emitters of carbon, and they're saying, no, it's your responsibility. You have a carbon footprint the same as we do. We are trying to manage ours. You're trying to manage yours. And I can't remember if you drew this relationship in the book, but certainly for me, it had the parallels of the anti-litter campaign and the recycling campaign. The famous advert where I think it's a Navajo Indian who's crying at the side of the road. And when you tell people that this campaign was devised by the plastic industry, you kind of see these connections. It is that no, it's not us. You have to put your plastics in the bin. You have to cut your carbon emissions. It's not us, it's we. And I thought that was really, 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 really powerful. But just very briefly on that, when we're talking about agency and who needs to do stuff, where do you start? Where do you start and say, well, if we have to do things first, who does what? when do we get to kind of people like, I don't know, maybe not you and I, but people who are in the global south, or people who are from a kind of poorer background? Where does this kind of happen in your view of how we mitigate the problems that we're having with the climate?
Right. So I don't want to completely discount the moral value and thinking about ecological impacts or even carbon footprints, right? But I do want to firmly say that you cannot stop it by trying to reduce your carbon impact, right? In fact, I cite a study by MIT in the book that tries to look at different lifestyles and how, how is an average American lifestyle compared to a billionaire, compared to a person experiencing homelessness. And basically what we find is that if you were experiencing homelessness, your fossil emissions would still be roughly something like a third of what they are as just an affluent person in the West, right? So globally, the top 10% produces half the emissions. And by the way, that's probably me and you, right? Anybody kind of above poverty level in a developed country is part of the global 10%. The top 1% globally produces about 1.5 times as much emissions as the bottom 50% of humanity combined. So there's a massive mismatch. But it's not something that you can do individually, right? Like the solutions are fairly simple, right? I mean, like the way to address climate change kind of goes into 3 buckets, right? We can improve efficiency so we don't need as much materials or energy. We can electrify everything. That's the main one, right? With carbon-free electricity. And then we can carbon capture for the rest, right? That's the mitigation, right? Basically those 3 things. I always like to emphasize there's an enormous opportunity for average people to get involved in adaptation work, right? Because that adaptation is everything from seawalls to, I don't know, what do you think is going to happen to food scarcity and homelessness and addiction in your community when economic shocks really set in? Like we're not that far away from massive blows to crop failures and multiple bread baskets at once, right? What can you do as an individual to kind of think through what would happen if property values in my neighborhood tanked 30% in a year? Like how would the ripple effects, it's a little bit different in the UK, but for us, for example, that means that the schools would get less property tax funding, right? So now the schools would start to suffer, right, and have to fire teachers, right? So like school educational quality, a number of teachers per pupil doesn't look like something that's climate change, right? But it's going to be very, very tied to the ripple effects of climate change, right? So there's enormous opportunity. I always want to kind of say there's an enormous opportunity for everybody to get involved with thinking about how you can adapt. What things can you get involved with in your neighborhood? Are you a lawyer? Do you have public relations or marketing experience that you can plug into activists who are typically very young and unskilled and unconnected to the broader community, not power players? Are there things that you can, like ways that you can pull your own way or throw your weight around, I should say, or donate time and energy and money? But as far as stopping the progress of the storm, this is precisely the problem, right? In my more pessimistic moments, I grew more politically pessimistic, even while more technologically optimistic writing this book, right? We can supply all of the energy we need in the entire world, all 19 terawatts of energy that we run on civilization, by covering 1% of our Earth's surface in solar panels, right? Like we have the materials right now. Like we will eventually run out or have to move on to certain materials, right? We'll have like lithium problems eventually, but solar panels are made of silicon. It's sand. We have plenty of it, right? We can plant those solar panels in deserts that are unoccupied and easily take care of all of our energy needs. The problem is purely political, right? And when I say the problem is political, like it's economic, right? Like it's part of that Marx's law of accumulation, right? So my mind game is always, what would happen if the powers that, because if this gets solved, it has to be solved by some sort of global behemoth or leviathan, to kind of take Jeffrey Mann's example from Climate Leviathan, right? Like you're going to need either a centralized liberal capitalist climate governance, right? Or some sort of like central power socialist government model, right? And the second would be like clearly preferable, but it kind of depends on like how China kind of like takes center stage in the next over the next century, right? But yes, okay, so global power can change it, but right now we're in sort of a behemoth scenario where let's just say that all of the leaders of all the fossil fuel companies in the world and all of the global leaders said, for the good of everyone in the next year, we're going to wind down fossil fuels and not pull any more out of the ground. What would happen, right? Well, the loss of natural gas for the Haber process that creates nitrogen fertilizers that feed 3 or 4 billion people means that 3 or 4 billion people would starve in the first year. It also means that if you cut 80% of the fossil fuel inputs for our energy, you get like an 80% energy loss, which means you get an 80% economic loss, right? So you have you half the planet starves while the other half is glowing into ultra permanent depression, right? Which means you get fascist on the rise, you get global wars, the very high chance that it goes nuclear. None of that is what we want, right? That's a nightmare scenario, right? So how can the powers that be wind this down, right? It's not a mystery, right? It just cuts against the law of capitalist accumulation, right? We need more massive amounts of capital investment directed by the state to clean energy and carbon capture, right? And electrifying everything. And it's really quite that simple, right? It's just we need massive public investments everywhere. And we need to get electricity to the 800 billion people in the world that don't have it, and increase living standards elsewhere while drawing down living standards in the West. And so like we know the options. It's just the options are not lucrative in terms of profit, and that is really the problem, right? It is just not profitable to save ourselves.
And that comes across really strongly in the book. It's kind of, capitalism is clearly not the solution. We're not quite sure what is the solution, but one thing we can say is this kind of growth paradigm and this capitalist paradigm is a huge problem. I wanted to finish just because it was an element of the book that, I hadn't really thought much about. And it was this denial, and coming from a kind of psychological position. And you mentioned Freud a lot within the book, which I found fascinating. Nothing I've ever looked into. Would you just like to kind of finally just kind of summarize the problem and the issue and the reason that people deny these really worrying, dangerous things?
Yeah, sure. So much of my work for the last few books has come out of Freud, or more specifically his disciple Lacan, French psychoanalyst later on. But Freud writes this essay on negating distressing ideas, where he kind of says, when my patients have something coming to the surface that they've repressed, and they experience that repressed idea coming to the surface as a threat, what they will do is they will mitigate that problem in one of two general bucket ways, right? One will be that they will look at that idea that's coming to the surface and deny its reality. And the other is that they will accept that idea coming to the surface, but deny that they are morally culpable for it, right? So you have a reality denial or a guilt denial, right? And these are the two denials that you can kind of see in Western major parties. You have your conservatives denying reality, and your liberals kind of denying the moral culpability by tailoring offsets or fantasies of carbon capture or fantasies of inevitable decoupling. Green growth, yeah, exactly. So how can I accept reality but kind of say that it's not my fault? Hey, how can you blame me? I believe the correct thoughts about the climate crisis, right? It's I'm not the bad guy here. The bad guy's doing the same thing as me but doesn't believe in it, right? And that's kind of how it plays out, right? But I mean, like what I love about psychoanalysis is the concept of an unconscious, right? The reality that the drive is irrational, that people don't desire rational things or know what they desire, and frankly, people get an immense amount of surplus enjoyment by getting really close to what they want and then sabotaging, right? And this is a curiously familiar human pattern, and people find ways to enjoy precisely by not knowing, right? What a psychoanalyst calls perverse fetish disavowal is best evidenced in the way that liberal governments will say, yes, I know that the climate crisis is happening. Nevertheless, I will act as if it doesn't, right? This is what in psychoanalysis, like the structure of perversion is the one that kind of said, yes, I know this fetish I have is, we're play acting in a certain way. I'm pretending, but nevertheless, I enjoy pretending in such and such a way in the bedroom, right? You get the same exact structure here with, yes, the climate crisis is catastrophic. It will kill billions. It's the biggest thing that ever has happened. But look at us. We're on track to quadruple new oil uses by 2030. Isn't that great?
No, I found that absolutely fascinating. And that kind of idea that denial is a really happy place. And that when you kind of shake someone from their happy fantasy, they don't say to you, oh, Tad, thank you so much.
No,
for
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. It's a threat. People, because you enjoy denial, and that's not pathological in itself, right? Like it would be very, very difficult to kind of get through life and enjoy life without all kinds of denial, fantasy, overlaying things, thinking things will happen that aren't going to happen, repressing things that are too disturbing to kind of sit with on the surface all of the time. Reality is kind of like all the way through. It's torn up by fantasy and denial and repression, and that's what it is to be a human being. It's just that it's extremely dangerous when you're facing the biggest thing that has ever happened since the dawn of agriculture.
Thank you so much. And my final little plug for the book, it's quite a thin book. And I hope I've given you an idea of the huge amount of stuff that's in here. There was so much we could have spoken about, but we didn't. Tad, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for writing the book.
Yeah. Well, I hope everybody gets the book. If you use the promo code denial at just denial at Versa's website, it gives you a little bit off. And I also just want to plug, I have a podcast version, just a 3-episode podcast to kind of give you a taste of some of the research. And one of the podcast episodes is on the Marxian economic side of things as well. But thank you so much for having me on. It's been wonderful.
Thanks. Nice to meet you. Bye for now.
All right.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks very much for staying to the end. And Kieran's on our chat and she's not on screen. Hello, Kieran. Sorry, I've got technical problems and we couldn't get you on. So I apologise to our audience that you can't hear from Kieran this evening. If you were here for the start, couldn't play the video. Kieran wasn't in the little area where I bring her onto screen, so I apologise for that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. As I said, I think it's really timely considering everything that's happening in the States and also hopefully to a lesser extent what we're seeing in the UK. Any more comments and questions, and we'll just kind of cover them. But it's been a long episode tonight, already past 9 o'clock. So I'll see if there's anything coming up, and then just say thanks very much. Next week, same time, now a regular time, just about 8:05 on a Wednesday, we've got a really interesting conversation with an academic who'd written a paper around the European Central Bank and what it's doing in terms of its kind of green strategy and how it's helping finance or support the green transition in Europe. It's a really interesting conversation, I think, as we're thinking about possibly a new form of central bank or some new central bank regulations in the United Kingdom or a new central bank in an independent Scotland. All we can learn, everything we can learn about what other central banks are doing, I think is exceptionally useful. This is a really interesting conversation and that'll be live this time next week. So thanks very much, everyone. Appreciate your engagement this evening. Again, sorry, Kieran. I'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully, I'll see you next week. Thanks so much, and bye for now.